Hello, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Helion virtual book launch. I'm Andrew Bamford. I edit the From Reason for Evolution series. I can see we've got from the chat a mixture of veterans to these events and first-timers as well. So just while people are still filtering in, I'll very quickly do the tech support side of things, which I'm sure half of you could probably recite for me with no difficulty at all. The platform we're using, if you're not familiar with it before, Demio, is entirely web-based. As you know, you've not had to download any software to get in tonight. That's the upside. The downside is that it's entirely web-based, so it is reliant on your browsers and your internet connections. Hopefully, you won't have any tech issues during the course of the session. If you do, the first thing to recommend is the classic IT crowd solution: turn it off, turn it on again. By which I mean just come out of the browser and rejoin from the link that you joined by. If that doesn't work and you've got multiple browsers installed, you may find it worth switching to a different browser. It does seem to respond better on some than others. And if you are running other things, other windows on your machine, or if there are other people in the house using the internet, you may find that that's slowing things down, and the less competition that you've got against us, the better for things. As I say, hopefully you won't have any problems. If anybody has irredeemable difficulties, of course, you will get the video sent automatically at the close of the session. That should arrive in your emails at some point this evening. It will be raw and edited video. It's done automatically, so you'll have the dead 6 or 7 minutes at the beginning with the title slide as people were coming in, and a bit of dead space at the end, and we'll put a tidied up version on YouTube shortly. There is a discount code for all you lucky people tonight. So if you haven't already bought the book that we're about to hear about, you'll be able to do so via the Helion website with a code which I shall pop up in a moment. But really, I'll stop waffling now, and in a moment I'll bring our speaker for this evening onto the stage, which is, of course, Robin Thomas, talking about this new volume, No Want of Courage, British Army in Flanders in the French Revolutionary War, which is, all right, I'm biased, I commissioned it, I've got to try and sell it, but I think an excellent work, which in terms of organisational and administrative military history is one that will be up there with the Holdings and the Guys of this world in terms of our understanding of how the British Army functioned. So without further ado, I shall bring him on. One moment. Hopefully Robin will appear shortly. Here we go. Right, good evening, Robin. You've got your slides, you've got your audience. I'm going to leave you to it.
Right.
Oh, sorry, beg your pardon. Before I do, sorry, questions, of course, questions. Please post your questions in the chat. Most of you have found the chat already. It's very helpful for me in terms of reading them all out at the end of the session. If they don't all appear at once, if people have a question as Robin's talking, pop it in the chat. If by the time we get to the end of the talk, he's already answered it, I shan't read that one out. But it's easier than getting lots of questions at the very end. So sorry, Robin, I do beg your pardon. That was a bit of administration that I really needed to get out there, but I will now disappear. Over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Andrew. And welcome to everybody at this virtual book launch. I know time is precious, so thank you for spending a bit of time here this evening hearing about this new book, No Want of Courage. For those who are into uniforms, the cover shows a trooper of the 11th Light Dragoons and 2 soldiers from the 33rd Regiment. This is dating from 1795. So thank you to Andrew Bamford for finding that for me. Okay, so what is this book about? Essentially, it's about the daily functioning of a British expeditionary force in the late 18th century. And I'd always been interested in the revolutionary period, basically because there wasn't that much written about it. And so I had a number of questions, if you like, that I was interested in investigating. For example, how the expeditionary force was directed. By that I mean the headquarters staff, who populated it, how did they actually do the job day to day? How was it supplied with food and forage? This is an area which I have to say is not that fashionable in military history, but I feel to understand how armies moved around the landscape, you really do need to look at how they were provisioned. And obviously, in this era, we're looking at horse-drawn armies, plenty of horses there, which need, straw and oats and all sorts of things to get them going as well. The medical side of it is slightly better known, mainly because of the work of various academics in the last 20 years who've been investigating military medicine as a profession, and how practitioners related to society in general. But in terms of this campaign, it's better known if you read the pages of Fortescue, Volume 4, History of the British Army, as being a bit of a medical disaster. So I was interested to see, was that actually the case? What were the causes of that? How did it actually work on campaign, as opposed to the theoretical works that you normally read about in Britain? Obviously, we're talking here about the very first steps of the British Army on campaign at the beginning of what Bunbury called the Great War with France, over 20 years of conflict. How did the army transition from a peacetime role to being part of an expeditionary force fighting the French in the Low Countries? And I should say, when I mention the Low Countries, I'm talking about what's essentially modern Holland and Belgium. But back then, Belgium was part of the Austrian Empire and was called the Austrian Netherlands. And what we now know as the Netherlands or Holland was the United Provinces. And so I'll talk about Holland and Belgium just because those are easier for the modern ear. But back then it was the United Provinces of the Netherlands and the Austrian Netherlands. So how was the army transitioning from peacetime establishments to wartime establishments? How did that affect the regiments on campaign? And what sort of impact did things like the heavy recruitment programs have? We've heard about the crimps, the independent companies, that sort of thing. How did that all fit in, and how did it affect the regiments on campaign? Lastly, I looked at the ordnance, because there is not much written on the work of the ordnance troops, and by that I mean the Royal Artillery, the Royal Engineers. At this period, the Royal Engineers is an officer-only corps. The other ranks are in the Royal Military Artificers. So how did the structure of the ordnance troops on campaign, how did that affect operations? How were they organised? How well trained were they? And what were they equipped with? So also, how did any of the things I've just mentioned, how did they affect combat operations in front of the enemy? So that's essentially the sort of things I was interested in investigating when I first started. Here is the contents page. The chapter headings are fairly self-explanatory. I'd like just to mention something about the appendices here, because what I've tried to do is illustrate the increasing amount of bureaucracy that was a feature of the British Army as time went on. The number of returns and reports and things requested from headquarters is really just beginning at this period, and it gathers pace as the French wars continue. So things like strength returns, casualty returns, magazine states. I mentioned earlier the importance of the commissariat. So what were they actually being provisioned on? and how many days supply was there at different points in time in various magazines. Appendices 4 and 5, these ones really aim to show what the army actually did, because combat is very much a sort of minority feature in terms of how many days per year, let's say, troops were engaged in combat. Very, very small indeed. But what they did every day was march somewhere, pretty much every day. How did they go about doing that to avoid being a sort of disorganized mob? And it's also kind of illustrative of how the staff at headquarters went about their role in making order out of potential chaos. Appendix 5 on the dispositions for opening the first parallel of Valenciennes. Anyone that looks at a map of northern France at this period, you will see a double fortress barrier of Vauban fortresses, and the Allied army basically battered itself against that double line of fortresses for the first 18 months or so of this campaign. So the soldiers were spending a lot of time going from siege to siege. But how did they actually go about doing it? How did the army organize itself when it sat down in front of an enemy fortress? So I put a general order from the orderly books issued by the Duke of York's headquarters about how they actually went about doing that. And then lastly, the ordnance train, we tend to think in terms of artillery batteries at a later period. They didn't really exist here. And so what I wanted to show is what the ordnance assets actually consisted of. And this is not just guns. This is, all the wagons, the horses, the spare personnel to fill in gaps from casualties, the spare parts, spare equipment, all this type of thing. It's a major asset in the 18th century context. This huge ordnance train, very demanding in terms of personnel, transportation, and money. So I put an appendix there just to show what it actually consisted of. Okay, so in my first chapter, I'll go through more or less what I've addressed in each chapter. And the first thing is to try and set the scene. Now, these three guys are the Duke of York is appointed the commander-in-chief of this expeditionary force, as you probably all know. But these are his political bosses, the people who have decided to deploy the army in the first place, and who decide on the strategy it's going to follow once it gets there. So William Pitt, we all know about him, Pitt the Younger, as Prime Minister. Henry Dundas, who starts off as the Chief of the Home Department, and Lord Grenville, who is Chief of the Foreign Department. These are the only two Secretaries of State that existed at this period in our history. Dundas was shifted on to be Secretary for War in the middle of 1794 and replaced at the Home Office by the Duke of Portland. But until then, there are only two Secretaries of State. So all these decisions about how and where to deploy the army are taken by these three guys. So if you look at all the documents in the National Archives, there are very regular dispatches, daily, weekly dispatches from the army mainly to Henry Dundas, because they're reporting back basically every move they make. As far as the British Army is concerned at home, the Commander-in-Chief, Lord Amherst, only appointed in January 1793. He's an old man at this point, and he's got quite a few reservations about his capabilities to do the job, but he's appointed anyway. He'd been Commander-in-Chief during the American War, but he is known for not really being able to face up to politicians. So he gets on with his job, but the three politicians we've just met are the ones really calling the shots. It might be surprising for people to realise that the British Army in the 18th century really only had a Commander-in-Chief during time of war. So in peacetime, there is no Commander-in-Chief. His predecessor General Conway had left office in 1783 after the American War. So there's been 9 or 10 years with no CNC at all, and the army has been administered by the politicians. The guy on the right-hand side is the Duke of Richmond. He's Master General of the Ordnance, and this is a Department of State. It is not part of the army. He is a cabinet minister. He has a seat in cabinet, and he is de facto military advisor to the cabinet. Now, the only problem is he doesn't get on with anybody. He's known as being a very difficult individual. So the cabinet doesn't really ever consult him at all. He does say some quite useful things, but just nobody bothers to listen because he's just not a very nice chap. He also doesn't think the expeditionary force should have been sent to Flanders in the first place. And he doesn't get on with the Duke of York, mainly because he thought he should have been appointed CNC, instead of which the Duke of York was. So there's friction all round, and it ends up in a bad place when basically William Pitt fires him more or less at the same time this campaign ends. With the army in Flanders, there's a large Allied force commanded by the guy on the left-hand side, Prince Coburg, who is a senior Austrian general. He is commanding roughly about 105,000 men, Austrian or from the Austrian Empire. There are much smaller national contingents supplied by the Dutch, about 15,000 under the hereditary Prince of Orange. The Duke of York commanding the British, by the end of 1793, only numbering about 8,000 men, quite small, in fact, about 7,800 men, something like this. And because Britain historically had a very weak army in terms of numbers, it would hire loads of German auxiliaries. Very common, every 18th century conflict, there are men from Hesse-Darmstadt, Hesse-Kassel, Baden, and obviously from Hanover, because King George III is also Elector of Hanover. The Hesse-Kassel troops about the same number as the British, the Hanoverians slightly more, about 11,000. So we have an Allied army under Austrian direction, and the Duke of York is, if you like, a formation commander within that Allied army. So Prince Coburg is his military boss on the ground, and we've met his 3 political bosses in London. So the message from this really is he is not a free agent, and he's dependent on the Austrians for men and resources to a very great extent, because the British Army just doesn't possess a lot of the materiel required for this type of campaign. Right, so moving on, I've written one of the chapters on the staff, and I was interested to know who these guys were, how were they actually appointed, and why were they appointed, and having been appointed, what did they actually do? And of course, you know, the million-dollar question, how effective were they? What I've done is to look at the development of British Army staff throughout the 18th century, starting with the War of the Spanish Succession, the Duke of Marlborough's staff. But there's very, very little, I think you'll find, that's been written on this. There's an excellent book by Stuart Stansfield, again published by Helion, looking at the Duke of Marlborough's staff. And then you've got to wait till SGP Ward, Wellington's headquarters, looking at the staff in the peninsula. But throughout that 100-year gap between the 2 campaigns, there's not much really written about how the staff operated. So I've looked at all of the headquarters department, commander-in-chief's department, the adjutant generals, quartermaster generals, provost marshal, barrack master general, and deputy judge advocate. What did they actually do, and who were the people in those departments? Now, most of this has come from the orderly books, which most of which exist. There's a 4-month gap at the end of 1793, but anyone really interested in looking at the staff, you need to look at orderly books for whatever campaign you're interested in. Here are 2 staff members. Sir James Craig was appointed Adjutant General at the beginning of 1794. his predecessor, Sir James Murray, was fired as being sort of suboptimal, let's say. And the guy on the right-hand side, Henry Fox, he was, in fact, the third Quartermaster General appointed, because his predecessor, Colonel Moncrief, was killed in action at the Siege of Dunkirk in September '93. But the key thing with him, he has a dual role. So he's also a brigade commander. Might seem a bit strange, but this is the 18th century, and there are a number of other staff officers who had a dual role as well. Okay, moving on. The commissariat, critical department. We all have to eat daily, and so does the livestock, the horses and what have you. So the commissariat department did not exist in wartime, and it's a civilian department. Everyone pretty much is a civilian. They are men of business, and they don't report to the War Office, they report to the Treasury. So I was interested to find out who were these people, what did they actually do, and how did they operate, on campaign. In the first 18 months, you've got a fairly static campaign, so you've got fixed magazines. But then from the middle of 1794, there's a war of movement, which requires completely different skills to provision an army, which is not being supplied from fixed magazines. You've also got issues of seasonality. Crops don't grow year round. It sounds stupid to say it, but maybe this is something that is often missed when looking at military history. How and why do units move into certain places? And a lot of that might not be necessarily to do with enemy dispositions. It might be due to something, to do with the commissariat issues. So seasonality, the first units, British units, turn up in March 1793. This isn't even planting season yet, and the Prussians and the Austrians have been active in this theatre of operations in 1792 and the beginning of 93. So you can imagine what happened to all the harvest from 1792, and it wasn't just lying around in granaries waiting for our Commissary General to buy, to the British Commissary General to purchase. So it's all these sorts of issues here. I've put some images up of the one of the things that the commissariat looked at was transportation. Obviously, there's a wagon there with baggage and things on it. The top right picture is a Dutch rivercraft called a chute, and the bottom one is another Dutch rivercraft called a bilander. Transportation was revised, the whole policy was revised at the beginning of 1794, and the British build their own rivercraft, essentially, but they're used for everything from along the canals and the rivers to transport the sick, to transport ammunition and warlike stores, and also as kind of floating storage as well. You park your chutes or bilanders up a canal somewhere, and it's got your musket ammunition or whatever on board, and can then be transported somewhere else in the theatre of operations. So those are the sort of issues I was looking at with the commissariat. The medical services, I'll just put an image up here of Dr. Robert Jackson. He was the surgeon of the 3rd Regiment in 1794, and he subsequently wrote quite a lot of his experiences and stuff on this campaign later, some years later. But I was interested with the medical side of things about how they were actually organized. We all know regiments would have a surgeon and an assistant surgeon, but obviously you've got the general hospitals, and there were several in Flanders, and from 1794 there's a flying hospital too. So how were the medical staff appointed? What sort of qualifications did they have? Now, the best way to describe how it all worked in Flanders, if you put several cats in a bag and left them to fight it out amongst themselves, that's pretty much, unfortunately, how it worked in 1793, 1794. The Army Medical Board in London was in charge of appointments, and these were 3 old guys who were civilian part-timers. So you've got the commissioned surgeons and the assistant surgeons at regimental level who are appointed by warrant at this period. They're not, the assistant surgeons are not commissioned, and they have a kind of sense of humour failure because of the way these appointments are being made from London, in terms of who the Army Medical Board wishes to promote to the hospital staff and what sort of qualifications you need to secure promotion. And this caused a lot of unrest, and by 1794 it's having an effect on the medical care being delivered on the ground. So I've looked a lot at things like sickness rates and casualty rates as well, really to try and get behind the rather glib remarks made by people like Fortescue over 100 years ago now, just to see what were the root causes behind anything that happened in on campaign. Okay, the regiments. I saw a lot of wargamers registering when we started, so I guess this chapter might be one of the first ones you want to look at. How did the army transition from peace to war? And I hope this doesn't sound too controversial, but in the 18th century, I think an argument could be made that the British Army is not there really to fight wars. It's there as a police force to quell riots and keep public order in Britain. It's there to guard fixed defences, both at home and abroad. It is not really geared up for a continental war. So at the end, coupled with this, at the end of the American War in 1783, there is a massive round of defence cuts. Every infantry regiment went from 10 companies down to 8, for example. So all of this had to be addressed. Massive expansion in 1793 and 1794, different methods of achieving that. So you have the trained officers and men spread very thinly amongst various new units and independent companies and so on. How did this affect the units sent to places like Flanders? How did that compromise combat effectiveness? So I've taken quite a lot of time to look at that. Also, flank battalions. Remember, again, this is 18th century. So the light company, grenadier company are hived off and they're put in separate units, flank battalions. Another important area, which again is not really mentioned in most campaign histories, is the women. I was able to quantify how many women were with the army in Flanders, and children, basically from embarkation returns, because they're pretty much all listed, how many were sent over with each regiment. So what did they do when they got there? These are the women officially accompanying units overseas. They're subsisted by the army and they're subject to military discipline. And in return, the army expects them to fulfill certain roles, things like nurses in the general hospitals or the regimental hospitals, laundresses, etc., etc. What did they do? Did they experience combat? And in fact, I've found the case of a woman who did experience combat. Were wives of officers, for example, this type of thing. So I've gone into as much detail as I've been able to find on women in this campaign. The other thing I looked at with the regiments was, and I've mentioned the very hasty raising of a lot of units, and it beggars belief actually when you read some of the descriptions, but a lot of new units are sent over lacking massive amounts of equipment, everything from clothing, recruits not dressed in a red coat, for example, but dressed in what they called slop clothing, which is what would be handed out to recruits when they went to the recruit depot. accoutrements missing, weapons not provided. The Duke of York had to commandeer 1,000 muskets as they were being loaded at Ostend, out of a total consignment of 10,000 muskets that the Board of Ordnance had bought at Liège. He had to intercept 1,000 just to arm his men because they'd been sent over with deficient equipment. Ammunition, regiments sent over with well below the standard issue ammunition allowance. Regiments again sent over with no battalion guns and had to be issued later. So what these two images here show is some young ladies dressing up, rather fortunate looking grenadiers with warm clothing, because certainly the winter of 1794, it's the coldest for 30 years. You've got about -10 degrees centigrade. So a lot of donation clothing is sent by the public in Britain. It's a form of kind of charitable giving. And this kind of illustrates the lack of equipment that many units had on during the campaign. Right, finally, I looked at the ordnance. As I mentioned earlier, this is the Royal Artillery, the officer corps of the Royal Engineers, and the other ranks in the Royal Military Artificers. The other ranks really had only been militarised roughly, I think, in about 1787. I'd have to check the exact date, but only shortly before this campaign starts. Prior to that, they were civilians. The artillery consists of two types: battalion guns, two light brass 6-pounders with each infantry battalion as close fire support, and the artillery park, which is everything else. There are no batteries as such that you would be more familiar with from later in the Napoleonic Wars. Guns of different calibers and different numbers of guns are assembled on an ad hoc basis according to the mission in view. What did the engineers do? Basically field works and siege operations. They're very few in number, hardly mentioned at all in any eyewitness accounts, but it's typical British Army. Very small number of highly trained professionals, totally inadequate in terms of numbers for a continental war. We saw it in 1914 and again in 1940, and then you have massive expansion and things kind of reach a measure of stability sometime later, but at the very beginning it's all a bit hand to mouth. So I was interested in looking at the effectiveness of the Board of Ordnance troops, the manning situation, particularly for the artillery. There aren't nearly enough trained gunners, so what happens, loads of infantrymen are hived off to man the guns, and that becomes quite an acute problem during the second half of 1794. The other thing is transportation. I mentioned the ordnance train at the beginning. Very heavy in terms of resources required for transportation. And when it was sent over, traditionally the Board of Ordnance would dispatch the ordnance train, and all the wagons and the horses would be acquired locally. The only problem with this campaign is they're fighting almost immediately. So one of the first things the ordnance commissaries have to do is find horses. Otherwise, the guns are going nowhere. And I should mention the original mission of this expeditionary force was to defend the United Provinces, modern Holland. And Holland is full of rivers and canals. So it was envisaged that assets such as the ordnance train would move by water. You didn't need wagons and horses. Suddenly they find the French have retreated to their own borders, and the British contingent is stuck because it has to find all these transportation assets before it can advance forward with the rest of the Allied army. So finally, here are just a couple of images of, I think the guy on the left, with the halberd, I would imagine is the sergeant in the Royal Artillery. And bearing in mind, this is pre-Act of Union, so there is the Royal British Artillery and the Royal Irish Artillery, which is separate. And there are some Royal Irish Artillery companies which participate in this campaign. The guy on the right, an artillery driver, and as you might guess from his dress, he is a civilian. The artillery drivers at this period were civilians. It's only really after this campaign ends that they are militarized, and you get drivers wearing a proper uniform and subject to military discipline. So that really concludes what I was going to say in terms of introductory remarks.
Thank you, Robin. That was excellent summary there. I can see questions popping up already in the chat. I'm going to go into the question folder now, and Rob Griffith, who is behind the scenes as the beautiful assistant for tonight, is going to keep flagging up questions for me. So I'm going to start reading them out. I'll pop them on the screen visually, but for the benefit of people who are watching this on the recording afterwards and who won't get to see the chat function, I'll read them out as well. So we've got a few to begin with. I think these are all actually from Alan, so well done, Alan. You get a whole raft of questions in one go because you've rather nicely themed them. I'll pop them up, but to do with issuing of rations for the most part. So to begin with, he asks, "Hi Robin, was the daily issue of rations done at battalion or brigade level? I imagine it must have been very difficult and a learning on the job for that campaign."
Yeah, it was learning on the job. Essentially, you've got to remember that the British element was part of the wider Allied army. And so the different national contingents did cooperate with each other, particularly when the army was shifted from one point to another. And, you're dealing with commercial contracts for delivery of commodities into fixed magazines, and then possibly separate transportation contracts, at least in 1793 anyway, going from those magazines to the troops. And if you look at the logistics, you move the army from A to B, and if from the magazine to B is a lot further than from the magazine to A, you probably need a lot more wagons to do the job. So in those sort of cases, the different national contingents would cooperate with swapping magazines or supplying each other, and the same with cash as well. The British supply the Austrians with a load of cash, I seem to remember, in 1794, and the Austrians supplied the British with commissariat supplies during the siege of Valenciennes, because that city was located closer to the Austrian magazines, basically. In terms of how the rations were issued, there are all sorts of instructions about this, how it was physically done. And essentially, unit quartermasters would turn up at the magazines or at the sort of forward depots, and they were usually issued with sort of 2 or 3 days bread or whatever it was, and then would have to make a requisition, in 2 or 3 days' time. So it was highly regulated. Each regiment had a unit quartermaster, would have a bread wagon, and that would trundle off to collect supplies for the given number of days. And there would be all sorts of form filling and bureaucracy. The supplies would be weighed and all entered on tickets, and those had to be forwarded to the commissary general, and they were all checked over by the commissary of accounts and that sort of thing to make sure the right amount had been issued and signed for. So it was quite a bureaucratic system, I have to say.
If I can follow up with that one, then just to pick up on what you were saying at the end there, Alan's sort of entry questions. Given the multinational nature, was there a standard currency used to buy the provisions?
Not really. The currency, you've got a mixture of currencies. you've got currency in the Austrian Netherlands. On the border areas, they seem to accept French currency as well, and obviously the United Netherlands has its own currency too. But the way the British Commissariat tended to pay was on bills on the Treasury in London. And so every time the army needed cash, they would issue bills for it to suppliers. And one of the things, the Commissary General is a guy called Brooke Watson, who's a very, very experienced guy. He'd been Commissary General in America at the tail end of the American War. He's an alderman, City of London, a member of Parliament, and he becomes Lord Mayor of London after this campaign ends. So one of the first jobs he had to do was to negotiate the levels of commission for currency exchange and for bills issued on the British Treasury with finance houses in places like Antwerp, The Hague, and Rotterdam. That was one of the first jobs he did in 1793. So it was dealt with in that way, but they had a military chest that accompanied the army as well with ready money, but that would have been filled through these agreements that he had made with finance houses locally.
Thank you. Okay, we'll give somebody else a chance. A question from Charles, who I get the impression differs on your take on Fortescue. He says, why the criticism? And he opens out to many contemporary historians, and yeah, all right, guilty, I've done it as well, have attacked his glib remarks. But have you checked his conclusions with other sources?
Well, yeah, I've used actually a lot wider range of sources than he did, because I think back then probably a lot of the primary source material wasn't available to him, and also he was covering a much wider spectrum of British Army's affairs than just this one campaign. So essentially the sources I've used, for the staff it's the orderly books. He didn't use those. For the commissariat it's the manuscripts, but the letters, that correspondence books was the expression I was looking for. The correspondence books between the Treasury in London and the Commissary General in Flanders. He didn't use those. The medical side of things, I've again used the primary source material comprising the letters and so forth between the Army Medical Board in London and the practitioners in Flanders. He didn't use that. So I think there's quite a lot of material which is probably available now, which was not available to him. And did I check his conclusions? Well, yes, in a word.
No, thank you. I mean, I feel rather the same. Fortescue does a brilliant job of covering the big picture, but as you say, sources that are available now and being able to drill down into a lot more detail. There's stuff I've come across with my own work that you're allowed to be a damn sight more opinionated as a historian then, without necessarily being obliged to footnote everything. And yes, I'm rather with you. He does occasionally fall down on things. Back to technical stuff then now. We were talking about the artillery and the way it was deployed. And I guess this question from Paul relates to then how we may be more familiar with it being deployed in say, in the Peninsula and later. So he asked, do you know what changed the way the army deployed its artillery?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that I haven't made comparisons with later campaigns, because if I'd done that with all these various aspects I'd looked at, the book would have been 3 times longer, I'm sure, and it wouldn't have been published now. But yeah, what we're dealing with at this period is essentially an 18th century army. What comes later is what comes later. At this point, battalions have their 2 light 6-pounders, and that is what they use. However, I think it placed a significant strain on the Board of Ordnance. And as I mentioned, a lot of units in 1794 sent over to Flanders without that equipment. you don't get the deployment of large batteries of artillery as you see in, for example, in the Peninsula, even the British. There are simply not that number of guns. I think by late 1794, the artillery park had only 27 pieces of artillery, and that is including mortars, howitzers, and field guns. So the rest is all these light 6-pounder brass pieces, which are held by at the battalion level. So I can't answer your question specifically about artillery doctrine. It's after this campaign ended anyway. But I would certainly, obviously, by the Peninsula, things are very, very different. But you're looking at the very end of the Napoleonic Wars. Peninsula War obviously only starts in 1808, as far as the British are concerned. And here we're dealing with a period that's, significantly earlier, when things followed the 18th century modus operandi. But what changed it? No, that's not something I've is within the scope of this book, I'm afraid.
Fair enough. I think that's entirely reasonable. Sticking with artillery, and I think you've partly answered this as you were reeling off the contents of the part. But the question was what caliber were the guns, which I think you've answered. But were they a common type, and is that the English and Irishman establishment difference?
There's a whole mishmash of calibers, to be honest. If you're looking at a typical battery, say in the Peninsula, maybe of 9-pounders or something. There would have been some, but probably not enough to make a battery. So you've essentially got heavy and medium 12-pounder guns. You've got 5.5-inch howitzers. There are occasional mortars. There's also captured French artillery because the French have a very significant artillery arm. Most of the eyewitness accounts mention the quantity of artillery the French have got. So because the French army in general, and certainly in 1793, the first part of the year, it's beaten heavily in a number of engagements, and a lot of guns are captured. And so some of these are reused by the Allies, and there are money given for capturing them. You might get £10 or something for capturing a gun. So some of those are deployed, and I found a list which is in the book of all the artillery brought over by Lord Moira's augmentation to the expeditionary force. Lands in sort of July thereabouts, 1794, about 6,500 men, and there's a whole list of his artillery, and it goes from sort of 3-pounders up to 12-pounders, basically. But the British don't have any siege artillery, except for one brief moment supplied during the siege of Dunkirk. It arrives too late, and the French capture it. So here today, gone tomorrow. So most of the campaign, they just have field artillery, which is ranging from sort of 3-pounders in the case of Lord Moira's force, up to kind of heavy 12-pounders, something like this.
Thank you. There is a final artillery question. I'll bring that one up now while we've got it from David, who simply asks, how deadly was the artillery during the campaign?
Well, I actually addressed this, how effective the artillery fire was. And of course, a lot depends on the situation of the enemy when you're firing your guns. Now, there are 2 or 3 cases during this campaign where it was very deadly indeed. That's the British artillery firing on the French. One was the siege of Valenciennes. I say British artillery, it's actually crewed by British, but it was Austrian guns because of siege guns. And there's a description by Corporal Brown of the Coldstream Regiment, who visits Valenciennes the day after the capitulation. And he says basically 1/3 of the town is just rubble. And you've got sort of the inhabitants crawling out of their hidey holes, sort of looking completely done for, having been subjected to this bombardment. There's another account during the siege of Dunkirk where, in fact, it's a single, I think it's a single from memory, battalion gun, and it is pointed at a bridge which the French are trying to cross, and obviously it's firing canister, I guess. And the description is that whole platoons of French are falling at every shot. So yeah, artillery is artillery, whether it's in Waterloo or the Peninsula or this campaign. The munitions are roughly similar. You've got grape, you've got canister, and you've got round shot. And the canister and the grape are divided into heavy grape or heavy canister and light canister, and that depends how many balls are in the munition itself, and the size of the ball, each ball. So they're obviously used for different things.
Thank you. Okay, well, we'll move back to the big picture in the top of the chain then. So a question from Ian. He asks, what conclusions did you draw about the effectiveness of the much maligned Duke of York, given the enormous handicaps that he clearly laboured under?
I think one, it's very easy just to kind of point the finger at somebody, and we see this today every day in the news. Somebody must be to blame, put all the blame on him. In the 18th century, look at, for example, Admiral Byng for the loss of Minorca. Yes, he might have had some blame attached, but was it enough to justify executing him? The one thing that was true then and is true today is that politicians never blame themselves, and that was the case in Flanders. Turning to the Duke of York personally, his only military position, I say only, prior to this campaign was as proprietary colonel of the Coldstream Guards. He was not responsible for the state of condition of the army at home in any way at all. So he finds himself as commander-in-chief of the expeditionary force, and he just has to make the best he can with the resources he's given. So, for example, one of the 3 line regiments that he has in 1793, there's basically 1 brigade of guards, 3 battalions, and 1 brigade of line, 3 battalions again. One of the line battalions, the 37th, spends most of that campaign in garrison. Why? Because it's chock full of recruits. The officers don't know their business, and they're more of a liability than an asset in the army. So they spend most of that campaign in garrison, presumably doing round-the-clock training. So this is the type of thing he had to put up with. And in terms of his combat effectiveness, or his ability, let's say, as a general, tell me any action where he failed. There are some of the most brilliant cavalry charges, particularly in the beginning of 1794, that surpass anything that happened in the Peninsula. And those were directed by him, basically. So I think it is a very hard point to prove that he was a bad military commander, and tactically naive and all the rest. Remember, most of the time he was acting under Austrian direction. And when he was beaten up badly at Tourcoing in May 1794, he was one of 7 columns. Most of the others were Austrian and didn't arrive at their appointed places on the battlefield, leaving him to face the full weight of the French on his own. So that to me is a problem with Austrian staff work, rather than fighting capability of the Duke of York and his men. So yeah, he did his best with the tools that he had. And I think because his lack of position at home, he was created the fall guy, because, as I say, politicians don't blame themselves.
Thank you. Well, I think we've got the last question, unless I've missed one somewhere, but I've deliberately saved it to last because it's a rather good summing up sort of question from Alan again. He says, what do you feel was the best lesson the army learnt following this campaign? It really sounds like a lot was taken from it as the army moved on in the period.
There's wholesale reform, really, in almost every area, and it's going on at the time, because because the leadership, even those three politicians, Pitt, Dundas and Grenville, they're not stupid. They can see the things that are going wrong, as can the army itself, as can the Duke of York, and the rest of the army. So even during the campaign, as it was progressing, for example, at the beginning of 1794, army transportation is taken in-house instead of relying on civilian contractors. So something called the Corps of Royal Waggoners is formed. They send over on the medical provisioning, they send over a flying hospital. Think in terms of casualty clearing station in the First World War. So they send one of those over. So the men are not the sick and injured men are not being transported long distances to get to general hospitals far in the rear. One of the first things the Duke of York does as Commander-in-Chief is to reform the promotion system, because there are instances in 1794 of battalions being sent over. Certainly one case I can think of in particular, where the CO, the Lieutenant Colonel, had been first commissioned into the army 12 months before. So he'd been a civilian 12 months before. He's gone through all the ranks and ends up commanding a frontline unit in an active theatre of operations. That's the sort of thing that the Duke of York did his best to stop very early in 1795 after he became C&C. So there's a lot of things which are amended, changed, reformed. Things like the artillery driver. You saw the guy in the image I put up in a smock. He's a civilian. So they militarize all of that and bring them under proper discipline. Virtually every area you can look at, the whole staff, having a permanent commander-in-chief, having a secretary of state for war, all of these things are happening at this period. So it's unfortunate, that we have the first campaign in a long war, and it happened at Dunkirk, it happened at the retreat from Mons. I'm afraid the British learn, unfortunately, at the beginning of the war and come good later, and this was no different.
Thank you. That concludes all the questions that I've got for you. So we're pretty much bang on time to finish at 8 o'clock on schedule. I don't think we could have planned that any better if we'd tried. It just remains for me to say thank you, really, and I'm sure the audience comments suggest that they've all enjoyed the presentation tonight. I will in a moment pop up the discount code again, and then in a moment after having done that, I will switch us off and let things die down. The next one of these events should hopefully be Alistair Nichols talking about his book on the Quiberon expedition, so sticking with the Revolutionary Wars theme. So hopefully those of you who have enjoyed tonight's will want to come back for that. I haven't got a date for that yet because I haven't got a date for the book coming out, so please bear with on that one. But you'll find information about that in the same place as you found information about tonight. But thank you again, Robin, very much. Go out and buy the book, people, if you haven't already, and I'll hopefully see you again in 5 or 6 weeks for another one of these sessions.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for coming.